Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 121 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, have you ever won anything?
Have I ever won anything? I mean, broadly defined, yeah.
Okay.
Granted, my sports teams in high school were, in general, quite bad. Um, but we actually were quite good at golf, and I was sort of the sixth man, to use a basketball reference for golf. Meaning, for anybody who's not a sports person, that's just kind of the guy along for the ride. Uh, um, Granted, there have been a lot of really terrific sixth men in basketball history, but it's basically for any really non-sports people out there, each basketball team has 5 players on the court at a time. The sixth man is called that because they're sort of the first one off the bench. They're not good enough to be on the court to start with.
Yes, there's a
But
reason why they're the sixth man.
Right. Anywho, I've won some things, I suppose. Why?
I've been thinking a lot about winning recently, and what it would be like if the New York Jets could reliably win football games.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I don't, I don't really want to talk about it because it's just one of those things that's not going to happen. But if you're a Jets fan,
for a Jets fan,
my dad really just doubled down on the sports fan as child abuse thing because he made me a Mets fan and a Jets fan, and it's a rough life I lead when it comes to sports right now. So.
Well, especially given how intense Bills fans quite a number of our friends are.
Yes.
I'm surprised.
It would almost make my life easier if I could blend in with them. Or even like Giants fan, like there's a fair number of Giants fans around where I live, but no, like I'm out here on a little bit of an island, just plenty like. And to be clear, I'm not like the world's biggest football fan, but like,
sure,
I would like the Jets to win football games.
I get that.
And theoretically, I'll be alive for a couple more decades, and they're bound to win a couple of games at that point. So
maybe a few games, hopefully. Not necessarily playoff games, but a couple of games.
Fingers crossed. On the time scale of this podcast of what we talk about, the Jets should be able to win a Super Bowl at some point in there.
Yeah, at some point.
Speaking of this podcast, Gavin, do you have any housekeeping for us?
I sure do. Do not forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and make sure to follow us on our Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. To give us feedback about the show and how we're doing, and also to suggest any future topics you'd like to hear on the podcast. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, we do have a Google form down below in the show notes that you can fill out, just letting us know a little bit about yourself and whether you might be a good fit to come talk to us on the show. And as for what is happening next week, that depends if Fia's here or not. Today it's just the two of us. Fia is very busy with moving and starting her PhD program, so she might be with us next episode. We're not quite sure. If she's not with us, we're just going to continue the topic from this episode because we definitely will not get through all of it today. It's you read the title, you know what we're talking about. There's a lot of stuff to talk about in there.
Yep.
And so we're going to keep this one in the back pocket for the next time Fia happens to not be with us. Just because I think it would be like kind of weird if she didn't hear the first part, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, we want the podcast to be accessible to people, so any episode could hypothetically be their first episode. But anyway,
on the rare occasions we have two-parters,
right.
This isn't going to be
this isn't going to be like a true two-parter like our way back in the day 600 million years in 60, which then turned into 120 minutes. It's not going to be quite a two-parter like that. You definitely could listen to each of these independently and, kind of understand what's going on. But on the hosting side, it'd be best if it was sort of consistent between the two. So whether that is next episode, if he is not with us, or, whether it's, a couple weeks or even months down the line, just like she's, busy with PhD work, how easy grad school goes.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So that will be potentially next episode. If not, I'll think of something else.
Wonderful.
And since Fee is not here, we do not have a swamp corner. So, Mike, what happened today in history?
So just very briefly, on this day, September 25th, 1945, World War II.
My friend.
Did I say, what did I say? Yeah, 27th. We're recording this on the 25th, but
yeah, we're recording this on the 25th.
Yes,
but
the 27th is the date that I have pulled up for today in history. September 27th, 1945. That was when U.S. General Douglas MacArthur met with Japanese Emperor Hirohito in Tokyo, and led to that famous photograph being taken where General MacArthur was rather towering over Emperor Hirohito at the end of World War II, which was a photograph.
So I just had like a little mini stroke. For a second I thought you said McCarthy, and I was like,
no.
Number one, McCarthy was a general. Number two, he went to Japan after the war?
No, different guy, as it turns out. Douglas MacArthur, famous for wanting to just nuke Korea shortly after this, and then getting himself fired for that. But yeah, as you know, as one does when you have this brand new bomb, yeah, you want to use it. And Douglas MacArthur wanted to use the bomb.
Cool.
Yep. So that is September 27th in history. Douglas MacArthur meets Emperor Hirohito for the first time. So with everything else out of the way, Gavin, monkeys?
Technically, yeah. We're learning a little bit about ourselves and mostly our ancestors here today in this episode. So, just as a little preface, this is going to roughly take us from apes, which we've talked about here and there before, through when the genus Homo evolves. So we're going to talk about some ancient apes, some ape features, and then sort of the connective tissue that gets us from, the non-human apes to humans. So, if you've been a very long time listener of this podcast, you might remember way back in like episode 2 or 3, I can't stand going back to listening to those episodes, so I don't actually know, and I didn't listen to them. Just because it was much worse, just like we were much less comfortable speaking, and it showed. But way back at that point, I had mentioned just sort of in passing, humans are garbage. We are designed poorly. That's why we have so much chronic pain in our backs and our knees and our hips and things. And we'll explain a bit of that today. And why we hurt in the places we do. And
wow.
Yep, almost 3 years later, we're finally going to talk about it. Yeah. Also, in episode 17, we talked about horses. And in that episode, I said that horse evolution is arguably the best understood sort of evolutionary lineage. And boy, was I wrong. And Mike knew it at the time.
Well, did I?
You even said, you were like, I feel like that should be humans. Or you said something to that effect. And I was like,
okay.
I mean, maybe. But I was very much in grad school, focusing narrowly on my horses. And Mike was absolutely right. Humans blow horses way out of the water.
All right, chalk one up for me on that one.
Yeah. And then lastly, for our previous episode references, episode 86, we talked about primates just sort of in general. So basically, we kind of avoided the topic of human evolution entirely because I didn't want to get into that can of worms. As I said, this is a very complicated subject where very rarely for vertebrate paleontology we have an extraordinarily large sample size. So that's what we're talking about here today.
All right, let's get into it.
Quick primate recap. These are all things that should be pretty familiar since they're you. But primates are an order of mammals that include lemurs, which are exclusive to the island of Madagascar, lorises, which are just sort of a weird, they're on the lemur side. They're mostly found, I think they're exclusively found in like tropical Africa. And so those two groups are on one side, and then monkeys are on the other. Monkeys are generally divided into two groups. There's the New World monkeys. These are the ones here in the Americas. These are the ones with prehensile tails, things like your capuchin monkeys, the ones that you see most of the time in movies that like have the little fez hat and like have the little symbols. Those are typically capuchin monkeys. Also things like spider monkeys. And then also we have the Old World monkeys. These are things like macaques, baboons, colobus monkeys, etc. And this also includes apes. So that's a very common thing that you had mentioned. You were like, so monkeys? And I was like, technically, yeah. So as we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast, you don't stop being a member of a group that your ancestors used to be in.
Right.
So technically speaking, yes, humans are a type of really derived monkey. We're very funny looking monkey. We don't have almost any of the sort of typical features that let monkeys do the things that monkeys do, but we are still monkeys. So, general primate traits that should be pretty familiar to us. They all have opposable thumbs. That's what lets you hold your cell phone. They have forward-facing eyes, unlike things like horses or deer, where their eyes face to the side. They have a very robust collarbone and highly mobile arms. This is why your shoulders are so broad compared to something like a cat that can just sort of slip through anything their head can fit through. Humans are not quite so lucky. We have generally really good color vision for mammals. Most mammals don't see color very well, but primates are very good at that. We generally have very short, very blunt teeth. We all have nails instead of claws. We all have plantigrade hands and feet, meaning so you're not walking on your toes like a cat or walking on like the very end of your toe like a horse. You're walking with your whole foot on the ground. And many, many more features. But these are all things that all primates share. We're also...
When you say like about the color vision, like do other animals see in black and white? I know that like with dogs, like they're red-green colorblind or something. Like is there a common way in which other species are worse at seeing color than us, or is it all over the map?
Yeah, so they're for mammals specifically, it's sort of thought that when mammals were sort of metaphorically under the heel of the dinosaurs during the Cretaceous, so when mammals were sort of just getting their start, or I guess in the whole Mesozoic era, that because mammals were mostly nocturnal at that point in time, you don't need to see color when there's not enough light for color to be reflected back at you. So that's sort of thought that was
Never
sort of a
thought about it
bottleneck.
like that.
Yeah. So that was sort of hypothesized why mammals in general have worse color vision than things like birds or even a lot of lizards. Most lizards have like excellent color vision. But I think, if I'm remembering right, there are three different types of... So there are two different types of cells that receive light in your eyes. They're called rods and cones. And I think it's the cones where humans have like a wider variety, or I guess primates have a wider variety than something like a dog. I think primates have three types, and I think dogs only have two, if I'm remembering that correctly.
That sounds about right.
But yeah, it's something to do with that.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure why primates. I don't know if it was just a mutation that reactivated a gene that didn't get reactivated in other groups of mammals or something to that effect. But a lot of it likely comes from that primates are generally frugivorous. They eat a lot of fruit, and fruit tends to be colorful. That's probably something to do with it, although there are lots of other mammal groups that eat fruit as well, so who knows? Another really, really important thing about mammals is that we are among the most social of animals. Every primate group, with the exception of some of those lemurs and lorises, they don't tend to be as social. But the monkeys, including apes and including humans, are incredibly social. So among the most social, with the exception of things like the eusocial groups, like ants, bees, termites, and also naked mole rats have that same kind of sociality as like bees and ants. Well, we can have a whole other episode about that sometime in the future. But I always like throwing that out there. They have like a queen, and they're drones, just like drone bees or ants. It's weird. So that's all general primate things. Then, among the primates, we have the ones that sort of stand out, which are the apes. There are currently 28 living species of ape today. There are 19 gibbons, which, if you watched the live action, quote unquote live action, Jungle Book.
I did not.
Yeah, I really enjoy that movie, actually. These are what a lot of the things that steal Mowgli and take him to King Louie. That's what a lot of these are. They look like monkeys, but they don't have tails.
Mm-hmm.
So they're apes. So there's 19 species of those. One species of Simang. So those two groups are collectively sort of called the lesser apes. They function very much like monkeys. They swing around in trees. In fact, their arms are like hyper elongated to be able to swing around in trees. And, they're called the lesser apes because they're smaller. Then, in the great apes, we have the 3 species of orangutan, 2 species of gorilla, 2 species of chimpanzee, and us. So, humans are what we in the evolution biz call highly divergent, meaning that we have many traits that our close relatives do not.
Many traits that are close, highly okay. I guess
So
that makes sense. Like with the branches diverge very far. Like there's a vast gap.
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
So for context, gorillas are equally closely related to us and to chimps. But chimps look a heck of a lot more like gorillas than we do.
Right.
So saying that, the branch goes back a long ways doesn't really mean what you sort of were thinking it means, because
okay.
Us and chimps split from gorillas at the same time.
So we diverged very far, meanwhile gorillas did not.
Chimps did not.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So that doesn't necessarily mean anything about relatedness. It just means that we started doing something really weird, and our bodies changed to accommodate that. So you can see this also in things like birds, for example. Birds are very divergent dinosaurs. They are not your typical dinosaur, at least back when they first evolved. So not necessarily talking about relatedness, but it's what sort of collection of features you have relative to your cousins. So, as you might have noticed by looking at a chimp or a gorilla, we have much less hair. We have gigantic heads and brains compared to them, like for body size. Notably, we walk bipedally. We don't walk on all fours like our cousins do. Even though our arms are quite long relative to the other apes, they are rather short. Chimps have much longer arms, in proportion to body size. We have quite small teeth for an ape. Especially the front teeth. Chimps and gorillas have the big canine teeth, especially in the big males, but even male humans don't. Speaking of that, we're not very sexually dimorphic. Next to our cousins, males and females generally look a lot alike, unlike especially in, for example, gorillas. And while all primates are generally pretty good at this, humans are exceptional at problem solving and pattern recognition. Those are the two things that really, make us stand out in sort of the smarts department. That's also why people see faces in everything, because our brains are hardwired to recognize faces, even in a lot of places where there are not faces.
See also why conspiracy theories are popular.
Yes. Just because a pattern is there doesn't mean that the pattern means anything.
Just because you see the pattern there doesn't mean the pattern actually exists.
True. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about why, or I guess how, and potentially why we became so divergent. So in the middle Miocene period, so we're somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 15 million years ago, the world's climate was cooling and drying out, mostly because Antarctica was continuing to move south toward the South Pole and being covered in the ice sheets that are currently there. Fingers crossed for the time being. And a group of monkeys in East Africa up through sort of Central Eastern Europe were sort of trending toward a more terrestrial lifestyle, coming down from the trees more often, growing larger, more robust bodies because they didn't need to be swinging around on the tops of trees as much anymore. Partially because, as the climate was drying, forests sort of turn into grassland sort of environments, and trees are just farther apart. So it's harder to swing from tree to tree if the trees are farther apart.
I mean, that makes sense, just gravity and all.
Yeah. And so this is also a key reason why we have such an exceptional human fossil record. Starting around this point, because they started spending less time in forests, which is good because forests are really good at, recycling organic material. So in order to become a fossil, you need to not be recycled. You need to be buried. So that's great. Step number one. Step number two, they got bigger. Smaller things have more fragile bones, which are more easy to break apart. But if you're bigger and have more robust bones, they're more likely to survive to be able to become buried. So already two great steps along the way to why we have such a great human fossil record.
Yeah.
So like I said, this is around the time when apes split from the other groups of monkeys. And there's actually been some really recent debate of exactly where this happened. For a long time, we'd kind of assumed that it was Africa, just because that's where most of the apes live today. Well, I guess it's not technically true, but that was always sort of the debate. Most of the gibbons and siamangs live in Asia, which is why you saw them in the Jungle Book and not chimps and gorillas.
So you're saying that the Jungle Book was geographically accurate, I guess?
Actually, yes, and I love this fun fact. So King Louis in the original cartoon is an orangutan. However, orangutans don't live in India, and they never have, to our knowledge. So in the quote-unquote live-action version, he is no longer an orangutan, he is a Gigantopithecus. And he even says that in his song, which is sort of a cousin of orangutans, which is very large, not quite as large as King Louis was, but up around 8-9 feet tall.
I mean, you hear the name Gigantopithecus, like,
yes,
that guy starting at center for the bulls or something.
Yeah, exactly. But and they changed him to a Gigantopithecus because it was regionally accurate. So fun fact, I really enjoy that movie. Yeah, so it was always just kind of thought that this is where we have most of our ape fossils from is in Africa, and also that's just sort of where we see a lot of them today. So that was always just kind of that was the most supported hypothesis, was that apes started in Africa. However, even just like 2 weeks ago, 2 to 3 weeks ago, I don't remember exactly when it was published, but there's a study published presenting new fossils from Turkey of the oldest known ape fossils, and they sort of suggest that apes may have evolved in sort of Central to Western Asia, and then migrated to Africa and Southeast Asia, where they live today. Although the authors made it explicitly clear that they were talking about apes and not humans. Certain groups of people are always looking for reasons to claim that humans did not evolve in Africa, mostly racism reasons. And so they absolutely did not want this study to be used to support that. They were like, we were talking about the very first apes. humans, as we know them, came from Africa. They made that explicitly clear. And we're going to be talking about that in a little more detail here in a little bit. But regardless of where the first apes kind of show up, they quickly spread all over the old world. So we have ape fossils from France, and I think even some from like Spain. So they were kind of all over, at least sort of the southern bits of Europe, not quite, way up in like Finland or something like that. But they were not sort of confined to the really warm areas that we, have them in today. Most of them kind of seem to have been behaving much more like gibbons, swinging around in trees, still had really long arms, so these weren't necessarily the great apes. Some of the more early, lesser apes, which is very offensive. I don't know why they're called that, but yeah. This trend in some more terrestrial lifestyle sort of continued as the world continued to cool and dry throughout the Miocene. And then toward the end of the Miocene, around 6 million years or so ago, we're just skipping a whole bunch. That's roughly when the chimpanzees went their own way and the human lineage went its own way. So around 6 million years is when we split from chimps.
6 million years ago. Okay.
Right. Not when you say we, long ago.
I was going to say, that doesn't seem that long ago. When you say we, define what we is.
So, we, in quotes, the royal we, would be what most people would call hominins.
Mm-hmm. And what is a hominin?
So a hominin basically just means a species more closely related to us than to chimpanzees. That's all that means.
Okay.
Or I guess I should say they have a more recent common ancestor with us than they do chimpanzees. I always feel like I need to clarify that because some people think the like genetic relatedness, and it's like that gets a little wonky because we don't know, But yes, more recent common ancestor with us than with chimps. And this part is where the human fossil record becomes truly, truly exceptional. For all those reasons above that I listed, we're big, and we started to live in places that fossilize pretty well. Those are really good reasons, but much, much more importantly, we have been looking for human fossils for forever. We've been looking really hard for them. Mm-hmm. And so this is just the most extreme form of sampling bias that there is in paleontology.
What do you mean?
So if you go out looking for only a certain thing, and you're spending all of your time and resources, mostly money, looking for a particular thing, you're much more likely to find that thing than you are something, somewhere else in the world or from a different time.
Mm-hmm.
So we know much more about human evolution because we've actively spent all the resources required to learn all this knowledge. So in paleontology, sampling bias is something that we're taught about very early on because that can lead you to a lot of conclusions that might not necessarily be accurate.
Right.
So if you were to look at just like percentage of fossils, or I guess a good sort of proxy for sampling bias is how many times have you heard something about T-Rex in the news, or just been scrolling through like the news tab on Facebook or something and seen something about T-Rex or just dinosaurs in general? Much more often.
All the time.
Yeah, much more often than, say, fossil clams. That would lead you to believe that we have many more dinosaur fossils than we do of fossil clams. Which is absolutely not true. We have tens of millions of specimens of fossil clams, numbering in the multiple thousands of species, probably. I'd be shocked if it were less than 10,000 species of just fossil clams, as opposed to like maybe under 1,000 species of dinosaur for sure.
That's so always wild to, like this, because you have said that before, and I know I've seen that other places, but just hearing how few dinosaur specimens we actually have fossils of is nuts.
Yeah. It's like a lot of the like really well-known ones too only have like 1 or 2 specimens. For example, the movie Dinosaurs, which we have talked about on this podcast, the Disney movie from I think 2000. That movie featured more Carnotaurus in the movie than we have specimens of, and there were 2 of them. We have a single Carnotaurus specimen in the whole world. Granted, it's an exceptional specimen with even like skin imprints and stuff, so we know what its skin was like. But we only have the one. We don't know whether it was male or female. We don't know. Carnotaurus, for anybody who doesn't know, is sort of a theropod with like exceptionally small front hands and 2 sort of horns coming off the side of their head. We have no idea whether those horns were sexually dimorphic, whether this one was a male and the females didn't have them. We don't know if this was a female and the male had bigger ones. We don't know because we only have the one. Anyway.
Just nuts.
Yeah. Tangent aside, that is why we know so much about human evolution, because it's us. We care so much about it because it's us. And we've spent all of this time and money on it because it's us. And humans have always been fascinated with where we came from, whether that's from a storytelling sense, a religious sense, or in this case a scientific sense. It's always been just an extreme object of our fascination. So all that to sort of say, in just the general broad southern Eastern Africa region, so sort of from Somalia-ish down to South Africa, around this time, we start seeing some of our relatives. There's a smattering of them up in Europe as well. For example, one of the earliest hominins is a genus called Greco-Pithecus, found in Greece. We have one called Aurorin down in Kenya. However, the sort of earliest confirmed hominin, we have lots of things sort of at the boundary between, is this a hominin? Is this somewhere a little further, up the line? But the earliest for sure hominin is a genus called Ardipithecus, or you very commonly just shorthanded as Ardi. So there are 2 species, both of them found in Kenya, ranging from about 5.5 to 4.5 million years ago. And these look very much like you would think, a early relative of humans looks. Would look very much like a chimpanzee. They had a relatively short snout, which is a general primate thing, but a little bit shorter than that of a chimp. They had smaller teeth than a chimp. Humans have thicker enamel on their teeth than most other apes do, so their enamel was just a little bit thicker on their teeth. They had a smaller, what's called a diastema. So that's in many things with big canine teeth, there's sort of a gap between their canine tooth and then the premolar behind it. That was just a little bit shorter. And this caused them to not have sort of the self-sharpening canine teeth. When chimps and gorillas, when they chew, when they just open and close their mouth, their canine teeth rub against each other and sharpen them. And in this case, that they couldn't do that.
Really?
They still had quite a small brain compared to humans, pretty much on par with what chimpanzees have today. But really importantly, when talking sort of about the rest of the body, their pelvis had some kinds of adaptations for upright walking. Their arms were still really long and much more mobile than human arms. They still had sort of the hand feet, so their big toe was off to the side so they could grab stuff with their feet much better than humans can. And so it's unsure sort of how bipedal they were, but likely could walk upright at least a bit. That doesn't say a whole lot because technically chimps kind of can too. So it's they definitely were not, running marathons. But they likely could have at least stood up and walked around a bit.
Okay.
So that was like I said, the first, I guess, earliest hominins that we have found.
Right.
The much more famous group that I would be shocked if you hadn't at least heard the name, if you're someone listening to this podcast, is the group that shows up basically right after we stop seeing Ardipithecus in the fossil record, and that would be the Australopithecines, mostly the genus Australopithecus.
And we've definitely talked about Australopithecus several times on this podcast.
Yes. And so this genus is known from all over southern and eastern Africa, from up to as recent as 2 million years ago, if not a little bit more recent than that, 1.5 million years ago. And this whole genus is a very classic example of a transitional, suite of fossils. So if anybody tries to say, we don't have any transitional fossils, which is a sort of thing that is still for some reason said by people who don't believe in evolution, that we don't have any transitional fossils, and I'm like, you're clearly just not. That's a bad faith argument.
Right. You don't want to.
Right.
You are predetermined your conclusion.
Right. And so this whole genus is very transitional. And all the features I'm about to say sort of vary from a species to species, but in general, this is the gist for the whole genus. But their jaws were still relatively wide like apes. So for example, your teeth sort of make like a U shape.
Right.
In most apes, it's sort of not quite as narrow. It's a little bit more wide. And this was still the case in Australopithecus. Their fossils show evidence of a very short childhood. They grew up really quickly, which is much more like apes than humans. If depending on how you look at it, humans take give or take 20 years to reach like actual adulthood, depending on how you define it. Could be closer to like 15 years, depending on how you define it. But that's very long for any animal. But relative
do we
to
think
chimps,
that their childhood was short, or do we just not have the fossils? Like,
we have the fossils.
Okay, so we have like, it is not just like absence of evidence. Like, there is evidence that the childhood is short.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we have enough of them that we can look at sort of their bone growth rings and things like that. Several of them that we're going to talk about later, some like particular individual famous specimens, we know how old they were, not just like when it was from, but like this individual animal died at 3 years old. We have the resolution on them to know that. Let's see. They still had rather long arms, more like apes than humans. Still quite sexually dimorphic. The males were generally much bigger, had a couple, skull features that the females didn't have. They had more curved fingers, which were good for climbing and grabbing branches and stuff. However, they had smaller teeth than Ardipithecus, a little bit thicker enamel than Ardipithecus, and as we'll talk about, probably much more in the next episode that we do on this. But their brains were a bit bigger than Ardipithecus. Still nowhere near human size, but it's not until we get to the genus Homo where our brains really just, get pumped full of helium and expand like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, the most notable thing about Australopithecus and why it is so famous is that they were fully bipedal, just like us.
Fully bipedal, like as in they like, it's not like they could have walked on 4 legs or 2 legs. They just walked on 2 legs.
They just walked on 2 legs.
Okay.
They probably would have had an easier time walking on all 4s than we do. But
they probably just would not have done that.
well, we actually know that they did not do that, at least,
Oh,
for good bits of time.
how do
We'll
we
talk
know
about
that?
that in a second. So, here comes my little rant about why humans are bad and garbage.
A Gavin
Just
rant.
from a structural engineering point.
This is one of my favorite arguments against intelligent design. Just like,
Yeah.
no, if someone did this on purpose, like you would never choose to do it like this.
No. So this section in my notes is just called "Why Humans Did Bipedalism Wrong." So many other groups have become bipedal. Many dinosaurs group. In fact, the default dinosaur condition is bipedal. Some of their early relatives, like some early crocodilian relatives, are bipedal. They did the easy thing,
Mm-hmm.
and they literally just made their tail longer and heavier, and then just picked their arms up off the ground. That's basically all they did.
Like as a counterweight.
Yeah, they just made their tail bigger and heavier to counterbalance their torso and their head, and then just lifted their arms off the ground and didn't fall over. That's just, obviously, it's not like individuals are making the decision, the evolutionary trends, etc. But they kept their spine horizontal, which means they didn't need to make a ton of other changes to accommodate being bipedal. Humans, however, had to change their entire body plan to do this. So, here's all the things that we had to do that other animals didn't to become bipedal. We had to completely move our foramen magnum, which is the hole in your skull where your spine comes out, your spinal cord. In most animals, that is at the back of the skull, because when they look forward, that's sort of the normal condition. Looking forward means that their foramen magnum is just perfectly lined up with the rest of their spine. Humans had to rotate that hole from the back of the skull to the bottom of the skull, which is partially why we have a lot of neck pain.
Wow.
Because our spine's not supposed to come out like that.
Mm-hmm.
We had to give our spine sort of an S shape to be able to support and give it stability as it sits, vertically over our hips. That S shape, instead of being just like a perfect column, columns are really good for being permanent support, but when you need to sort of sway a little bit, that S shape makes it a little more stable. We had to tone our core and back muscles extremely, not like super strengthen them, but just tone the heck out of them. Because those are what actually keep us standing upright. Your spine is just the bones that click together. It's all the muscles in your abs and your back that are what keep you from your shoulders from just slumping over all the time. I have a really bad slouch, so clearly my ancestors messed up. But that's what keeps us upright, is all the little tiny muscles that do all these little tweaks around our hips and in our core and our back that actually keep our torso upright. We had to expand the hips sort of out to the side to allow for these muscles to have a place to anchor. All of these reasons are why we have such back pain. Especially for me, it's not usually like my spine that hurts, it's my back muscles are just constantly always tired.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I know that feeling.
We also had to attach our femurs, so like your thigh bone, into our hips in a way that sort of allows the legs to be underneath us. The default leg position in mammals is underneath it, but because we had just the two legs supporting all the weight now, they need to be sort of directly underneath instead of sort of the squatting position that many primates have them in. And so that is partially why we have such hip problems, is because we had to modify our hips so much. We had to make our knee more flat to be able to make them sort of more column-like, and which gives more support. But trade-off is that they're not supposed to, they don't last as long. That's
Right.
partially why we have knee pain. And then the last one that really puts the nail in the coffin, which isn't like a real pain thing, or like why humans are bad. It's just I wish this didn't happen. They had to ditch the hand feet to be able to have all the toes in a straight line for more support. I wish so bad that I could just grab stuff with my feet.
It would be like
It'd
it's
be
one of
so
those
helpful.
things. It's one of those things like you wouldn't notice it or you wouldn't need it, except for those rare occasions when it would be so incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
It's a small thing, but when it matters, it matters.
Right. So these all of these things are why we get back pain. That S shape isn't great for living to like 50 years, even like 30 realistically. Humans didn't live that long at the time.
Well, how long ago was this?
This was still, give or take, anywhere between 4.5 to like 1.5 million years ago.
Okay, I just want to make sure we weren't falling into the when people say people only lived to like 30, 200-300 years ago.
No, that's just the
That's a different
average
thing.
Because infant mortality was so high.
Right. So we're talking about millions of years. Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, chimps can live to be like 50 in captivity, but like out in the wild, they never get that high. But yeah, so it's like 30 was like super old for any of these people from what I could find. The changes in the foot are why we get things like shin splints and plantar fasciitis. If we didn't have to be walking around so much on these sort of the feet shape that we had to get to be able to walk bipedally efficiently, we wouldn't have that. Knee changes why we need to get knee and hip replacements. Other animals do get similar issues for sure. But humans by far get them sort of like the earliest in their sort of life cycle. Even things like, I was going to say dogs, but most of that's kind of our fault for breeding them certain ways. But it's like even like wolves, I'm sure, get like, hip dysplasia or something like that. But it's like it doesn't happen until they're like real old, let alone me being 27 and my back hurts all the time. Yes, so all of that to say, walking upright the way humans do is really, really hard and a really big step in human evolution, which is why one of the many reasons why Australopithecus is studied so heavily. It's something that superficially looks very much like a chimp, but walks like a human, which just feels wrong. It feels like I'm watching Planet of the Apes.
Like some uncanny valley stuff there.
Very much. And we know for sure, to go back to your earlier question, we know for sure that Australopithecus was walking fully upright, not just from the anatomy, from the fossils. We know that from some of the most famous footprint fossils in the world. East Africa, particularly at this time, but also still a bit today, is pretty volcanically active, which leaves a lot of really nice, really fine ash layers. And so we have many trails of over 50 footprints in a row that just walk in a line through the ash. And it's really nice in that it's ash, because that means we can radiometrically date it and get like, pretty close to like within the decade accuracy.
That's absurd.
Yeah. Especially because it's so recent. The farther back in time you go, the harder it gets. But so we have these footprints that show nearly exactly how they walked, and it seems to be more or less like a human. One particularly famous site called Laetoli in northern Tanzania has over 70 prints of two individuals walking over this layer of ash, and very clearly they were bipedal. There's no signs of like hand prints anywhere. And it, to my knowledge, doesn't seem like they were like running either. So this isn't like a thing where it's like, oh, they walked around on all fours when they were just hanging out, and then but when they needed to run, they ran. No, this casual walking, upright.
Okay.
And so now that sort of, once they sort of established that, yes, Australopithecus was fully bipedal, the next question becomes, why? Clearly, there are some disadvantages to being bipedal the way we are. So there must have been some kind of advantage that pushed them to do it.
Right.
And there's been tons of speculation, but it's incredibly hard to say. That is, it's never easy to tell. But some features are easier than others. Why?
Would speed be one of them?
It could be. Less speed. Humans aren't fast. In fact, I feel like over short distances, a chimp could probably outspeed us. But like I said, certain features are much easier to sort of give a reason why than others. For example, like big horns on an animal. Yeah, there's only a handful of reasons that horns are used for.
Mm-hmm.
But completely changing like your entire body plan kind of needs more than just like a simple reason. So the first one that I kind of thought of was that it frees up your hands to do stuff while you're still moving. Because like with a lot of, even just like monkeys, just like, capuchin monkeys, spider monkeys, whatever, you see them a lot. If they'll just like, pop a squat on a branch or just on the ground and fiddle with stuff with their hands. Or they'll use one hand to carry something and then they'll still need to use their other hand to walk around. Humans, we can like do stuff, like actually do stuff while we're moving, which is just like a big advantage when you're constantly fiddling with things, as primates in general tend to do. Even back with Australopithecus, this made for a very energetically efficient gait. Humans are probably the best long distance walkers in the animal kingdom. We're extremely efficient in that sense. Very few animals can walk a marathon, and we run them. Even
Not all
like
of us,
that,
but
well, even the average person could walk a marathon if they had to. Like if someone told me,
Yeah.
"Hey, tomorrow you're gonna go walk a marathon," I'm like, it's gonna kill my entire day, but yeah, I can probably do it.
yeah, and like it would kill your day, but like it wouldn't be that hard.
No, like it'd take, the average person, 7 or 8 hours,
Right.
but, you could do it. Very few other animals, even like decently sized animals, could really do that.
Okay. I never even thought
Another
about it like that.
advantage, yeah. Another advantage potentially is it makes us appear a lot bigger than we actually are. Give or take, humans are somewhere between the size of a big dog, in the case of someone like Fia, to the size of like a small bear, to the size, someone, give or take Mike or I's build. However, even though we're that size, Mike and I are about as tall as a horse or a cow, but we're a fraction of like the actual weight and resources needed to get to that size.
So it's almost like a cloaking kind of thing, or like a disguise or misdirection or whatever you might want to call it. Like,
exactly. That's one of the reasons why, like, if you ever get, confronted by a bear, or like you're just hiking through the woods and stumble across a bear, that you get really big. You stand up really tall and put your hands up and yell at it, because they look at us and they think we're way bigger than we actually are.
That's a black bear, to be just to be clear, everybody.
If you have no other option, you grizzly bear too, if that's your only option.
My understanding with a grizzly bear was to lie down, like face down, and hope it gets bored.
I think it depends how big you are, to be honest.
Yeah, it might be something to do with it.
But yeah, so that by itself is just a fairly big advantage. And also one that is often talked about a decent amount, but I don't know how supported it is that it lets you sort of see further, or at least have a higher vantage point. There's been a lot of talk of like around this time with all the grasslands spreading, especially in like the savannas of Africa, it let you sort of poke your head up above the grass, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
But Australopithecus still lived in areas that were like relatively like foresty or shrubby, so that's not as supported as once thought, but it's definitely still an advantage to be able to see a bit farther than you could otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Australopithecus, they had all these potential advantages while also still being able to climb up trees if they had to. They still had all of the ape hand features that are different than humans, where they're not quite as dexterous, but still really good for like climbing and grabbing onto things. So they could, if they saw like at this time there were big saber-toothed cats living in this part of Africa. So if they saw one of these cats, they could just scamper up a tree, or more likely different dogs, since the cats could probably just climb up there and get them.
Yeah.
In fact, humans today still do this. If you're ever chased by a dog, I think most of our first instinct is to find something to climb. And so humans still to this day are pretty good at that. Australopithecus also has some sort of pop culture science around it. Talk about some like individual specimens. The most famous one by far is Lucy.
Yes.
Lucy, who was a little girl. We know she was a little and a girl. And she sort of gets a lot of press about just her, but she was found with a whole family.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yep. So she, that's sort of what's a little deceiving, is that individual, because we're, at least most people who have like a cursory knowledge of paleontology kind of know that like vertebrate paleontology doesn't have a ton of specimens. So it's like we hear about so much about like Lucy, and it's kind of just, some people kind of assume, oh, she must be like a particularly famous or like special one. Like she's like the one, or like the best preserved one. It's like, no, she was just one of the first ones found. Yeah, she was one of the first ones. There's also another really famous one from, I believe, South Africa, called the Tong child, who was around 3 years old. At the time, this was, touted as, or lauded, I think, that's the word, like one of the most significant, fossil discoveries ever, because this was one of the earliest that had like a really well intact skull. Earliest that we, like, as in we found it first, not like earliest in like, geology time. And so we've been talking this whole last however long that we've been talking about Australopithecus as if it's sort of one animal or one species. However, there's like 7 or 8 species, depending on how you count it, that span a period of 3 million years. And so also several other groups likely evolved out of Australopithecus, and all were hanging out around southern Africa at this time as well. So this is not sort of just like one species or one type of animal. All these different species had kind of a smattering of these different traits at different sort of, I guess character states is the technical term, but sort of different levels almost between more ape-like and more human-like.
Right.
And for example, even just within the genus, the earliest species and the latest species would have looked totally different from one another. The first species, Australopithecus anamensis, has been argued that it should actually be in Ardipithecus instead of Australopithecus because it is so different. And also, the most recent species, Australopithecus setiba, has sort of been argued that it should actually be Homo setiba because of how human-like it is.
Oh, okay.
And also, just for context, setiba existed about 500,000 years after the first Homo species. So these guys also were fully just kicking around with our like actual ancestors. Little quick note here, also just about how human evolution is all very often portrayed, is that evolution's not a line. It doesn't really work like that. That's why I sort of talk about the different smattering of characteristics around. All of these species of Australopithecus had, the varying degrees of each different various combinations of all these different features. And for sure, there is like a branch that continued all the way through Australopithecus, connecting a couple of species that then became the genus Homo. But there were all sorts of others along the way as well. And they, are equally as important to our understanding of our ancestors. So I want to highlight a couple of these other sort of little side branches that didn't end up leading toward humans. There are two other genera all around the same time, all around the same places, that are thought to have evolved out of some species of Australopithecus to become their own genus. So these are the genera Paranthropus and Kenyanthropus.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these, each has multiple species within it, and they each evolved features that made them convergent with gorillas. They evolved to be like a bit beefier. They had bigger teeth, stronger teeth, big crests on their heads for big, strong jaw muscles to attach. These two groups are often sort of just referred to as the robust Australopithecines because they're just Australopithecus, but just beefier. And so it's likely that they were doing similar things to gorillas, being like eating lots of nuts and eat lots of seeds, which are sort of tougher, just other types of tough plants. So just hanging out with our, actual ancestors. But these are just other apes fully walking upright, just like an upright gorilla, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And so just, it's often all the time, especially with human evolution, it's sort of portrayed as, this, then this, then this, then humans. And it's never like that, but especially we have amazing fossils that show us for sure that it was not like this with humans. And as always, when I'm talking about, groups, especially groups with a lot of data like this, I talked about this a bit with horses way back in that episode as well, is that evolution's messy and really doesn't like to fit in the boxes that we try to put it in. But it's hard to draw the lines when instead of individual points in time, like you get with some other groups of animals that we have fossils for, where it's like, 20 million years ago we have this, and then 18 million years ago we have this, and they're clearly different. It's easy to just draw the line between them. But when you have not points, but a full continuum, it's really hard to say, here's the line between Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, or Australopithecus and Homo. It's really hard to do that. And nature doesn't really work like that, but in order to be able to talk about things like this in a way that is understandable in any way, we kind of just have to.
Right. It's a necessity of, language.
Exactly. And this is both the blessing and the curse of the human fossil record, is that we have so much data. Each of these species, I'm sure there's a couple species that have like only a couple specimens, but we have thousands and thousands of various Australopithecus specimens that are so close together in both space and in time that it's really hard to draw those lines. We even have good enough data that tell us that, like, for example, the Tanzania population of, one species is slightly different in, these different ways than the South African species or, population of that species. And it's like, do we call those different species? Subspecies isn't really a thing in paleontology that often. But it's like, this is one of the rare cases where it's like, you could, yeah, exactly. It is all arbitrary. Although, technically speaking, species should not be arbitrary. But all the other parts should be, or by definition are.
Right.
Species, that's a whole argument that biologists and evolutionary taxonomists, have nightmares about.
Have we done an episode on that? I know we've mentioned it before, but have we done a full
we
episode
have.
on that? Okay.
We have. I don't remember what it is, but
It does exist, though.
Yes. I feel it's something. I'm sure taxonomy is in the name of the episode somewhere. It might have even just been called "What is a Species?" I don't remember. But all of this sort of ambiguity and arbitrariness and all of this excellent data is what makes human evolution so interesting to talk about. Because you get to talk about evolution in a way that fully encompasses both the transitional aspect of it, the sort of ecological aspect of it as to why these different evolutionary traits may have come about, why certain ones went away, as well as how, these animals dealt with other similar things being in and around their environment at the same time. It's actually kind of thought that, like, this might be why the uncanny valley exists. Because you need to be able to tell apart you from things that look a heck of a lot like you, but are not you.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. But this is really, one of the things that makes evolution so cool. Talk about it with humans. And it's really a shame that this is controversial, because there's definitely a non-zero population of people out there who fully accept evolution in everything but humans.
Oh, yeah.
And it's such a shame that by far the best example of evolution is humans.
Yeah.
Because they'll just, reject that at its face, which is really unfortunate. But all this to say, wrapping up here, lastly, that around 2.5 million years ago, another group besides Paranthropus and Kenyanthropus, another group splits off from Australopithecus, and we call those humans. Not the humans we know today, not Homo sapiens, but humans nonetheless.
But we're getting there.
No, we are there. It is accurate to call anything in the genus Homo humans. Think about that for a little bit.
Think about that for a couple of weeks, I believe, because it's at the end of this episode.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Gavin. I haven't told you this yet, but I've been waiting to go pee for like the last 20 minutes here, so I'm real happy that we have made it to the end of episode 121 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That was Gavin. We hope to be talking to Thea again soon, and we hope to see all of you back here in 2 weeks for our next episode. Until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.